There's nothing that breaks an old heart, quite like seeing children who've been thrown away by the world. Behind Murphy's diner, on a cold October morning, two small figures huddled together under a threadbare blanket, 7-year-old Lila clutching her baby brother Marcus like he was the only thing keeping her tethered to hope. The foster family that was supposed to care for them had dumped them here with nothing but a diaper bag and a note saying they couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Jean Whitmore, 73, and volunteering at the local food bank, found them there. She'd raised 5 children of her own and buried a husband after 50 years of marriage. She knew desperation when she saw it. But what she didn't know was that little Lila carried more than just the weight of caring for her brother. She held a secret that would shake their small southern town to its very foundation. What could a 7-year-old possibly know that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jean Whitmore had learned that sunrise was the loneliest hour of the day. She'd been waking at 5:30 every morning for the past 2 years, ever since Harold passed, and the silence in their old farmhouse had become both companion and tormentor. The coffee maker gurgled to life with the same reliable rhythm it had maintained for 15 years, though now she only filled it halfway. No point making a full pot for one person. She twisted the gold wedding band around her finger, a habit she'd developed in the months after the funeral, 52 years of marriage, and her finger still felt naked without it, even though she'd never removed it. Harold had slipped it on her hand in the tiny chapel outside Millbrook in 1971, promising her a lifetime of love and adventure. He'd kept that promise right up until the heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning while he was feeding the chickens. The kitchen window overlooked their vegetable garden, now mostly weeds and regret. Harold had been the gardener. Jean had been the one who turned his tomatoes into sauce, his green beans into casseroles, his cucumbers into pickles that won blue ribbons at the county fair. Without him, she'd let it all go to seed. Seemed fitting, somehow. She been volunteering at the Millbrook Community Food Bank for 6 months now, filling the empty hours between dawn and dusk with something that resembled purpose. It wasn't much. Sorting canned goods, helping families build their grocery bags, listening to stories that reminded her that everyone carries invisible burdens. But it was better than sitting alone in a house that echoed with memories. That October morning started like any other. Jean arrived at Murphy's diner at 7:15 for her usual coffee and wheat toast before heading to the food bank. Murphy's had been serving the same breakfast special for 30 years, and Jean found comfort in its predictability. But as she pulled her aging Honda Civic into the parking lot, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with familiar maternal instinct. Behind the dumpster, partially hidden by the morning shadows, 2 children sat huddled on the cold asphalt. The older one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7, held a baby close to her chest. They were wrapped in a blanket so threadbare that Jean could see through it in places, and the girl's eyes, those dark, serious eyes, held a wariness that no child should ever possess. Jean had raised 5 children of her own and helped deliver dozens more during her 30-year career as a registered nurse at Millbrook General. She recognized the signs of neglect and abandonment as clearly as she could read an EKG strip. These children weren't just playing or waiting for someone. They'd been left. She approached slowly, the way she'd learned to approach frightened animals and traumatized patients. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "I'm Jean. What's your name?" The girl pulled the baby closer, her small body tensing. "Lila," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the morning traffic. "On Main Street. And this handsome fellow? Marcus, he's my brother. The words carried a fierce protectiveness that reminded Jean of a mother bear defending her cubs. Where are your parents, honey? Lila's face crumpled slightly, but she straightened, her shoulders with determination that broke Jean's heart. The lady said she couldn't keep us no more, said we were too much trouble. She nodded toward a crumpled piece of paper beside them. She left us a note. Jean picked up the paper with hands that trembled slightly from both age and anger. The note was written in hasty script. Can't handle the responsibility anymore. These kids need more than I can give. Someone will find them. It was signed Mrs. Patterson, with an address Jean didn't recognize. The baby, Marcus, stirred in Lila's arms, making soft, mewing sounds. He couldn't have been more than 18 months old, with the same dark eyes as his sister, and skin the color of warm caramel. His diaper sagged heavy with wetness, and both children looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. When did you eat last? Jean asked. Lila, quote, S eyes darted away. Yesterday, I think, maybe the day before. Marcus had some crackers. Jean's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. Dehydration, malnutrition, exposure. These children needed immediate care. But more than that, they needed someone to see them as more than a burden, more than too much trouble. Well, Jean said, standing and brushing off her knees, I think the first thing we need to do is get some breakfast in you both, and Marcus needs a fresh diaper. Can you walk, Lila? The girl nodded, struggling to her feet while maintaining her grip on the baby. Jean noticed she moved carefully, favoring her left leg slightly, and made a mental note to check for injuries later. Inside Murphy's diner. Heads turned as Jean guided the children to a corner booth. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and two unknown black children with an elderly white woman was bound to generate whispers. Jean had lived here long enough to know how small-town gossip worked, but she'd also lived long enough to stop caring what people thought. Morning, Jean, called Murphy from behind the grill. His real name was Michael O'Brien, but nobody had called him anything but Murphy for as long as Jean could remember. Usual? Make it 3 breakfasts, Murphy, and bring some milk for the little one. Murphy's weathered face softened when he saw the children. He'd raised 6 kids of his own and had 11 grandchildren scattered across 3 states. He understood the look in Jean's eyes, the look of a woman who'd found something that needed protecting. While they waited for food, Jean used the restaurant's phone to call the Millbrook Department of Social Services. She'd dealt with them before, during her nursing days, when she'd had to report suspected abuse or neglect. The system was overburdened and understaffed, but there were good people trying to do right by children who'd been failed by the adults in their lives. DSS, this is Carol. Carol, this is Jean Whitmore. I've got a situation here that needs immediate attention. 2 children, ages approximately 7 and 18 months, abandoned behind Murphy's diner. Oh, Jean, hold on. The sound of papers, shuffling came through the receiver. We got a call about a missing placement yesterday. Foster family called and said they'd had to give up their charges due to, and I quote, behavioral issues and inability to bond. You think these might be the same kids? Could be. Girl named Lila, baby named Marcus. They've been out here all night from the looks of it. I'll send someone out, but it's going to be a few hours. We're short-staffed and dealing with an emergency placement in Riverside. I'll stay with them until someone gets here, Jean said. She looked over at the booth where Lila was trying to feed Marcus small bites of scrambled eggs while keeping watch on every person who entered the diner. These children aren't going anywhere without supervision. After hanging up, Jean slid into the booth across from the children. Lila had barely touched her own food, focusing entirely on making sure Marcus ate. The maternal instinct in someone so young was both touching and heartbreaking. Lila, you need to eat too, Jean said gently. Marcus is fine. You can't take care of him if you don't take care of yourself. It was a lesson Jean had learned the hard way during her nursing career. You can't pour from an empty cup. She'd seen too many parents, especially mothers, sacrifice their own well-being for their children, only to collapse from exhaustion and stress. As Lila finally began to eat, John noticed something unusual. The girl's eyes constantly moved around. The diner, cataloguing faces, exits, potential threats. But more than that, she seemed to recognize things. When Mrs. Henderson from the bank walked in, Lila's eyes followed her with an intensity that suggested familiarity, even though Jean was certain they'd never met. "Lila," Jean said carefully, "have you been to Millbrook before?" The girl's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I don't think so. But sometimes I remember things. Mama used to tell me stories about a place that sounds like here." "What kind of stories?" Lila's eyes grew distant. "About a big white house with columns and a garden behind it where roses grew all year round. She said there was a family there who lived like kings and queens, but they had secrets buried in their backyard." Jean felt a chill run down her spine. There was only one house in Millbrook that matched that description, the Caldwell Mansion on Magnolia Avenue. The Caldwells had been the town's most prominent family for 3 generations, owning the largest farm, the bank, and half the commercial real estate on Main Street. But what could a 7-year-old possibly know about their secrets? "Did your mama ever tell you the name of this family?" Lila's brow furrowed in concentration. "Something with a C, I think. Cal something. She said they were important people, but not good people." Before Jean could ask more questions, Marcus began to fuss, and Lila immediately shifted her attention to comforting him. Jean watched the girl work, checking his diaper, adjusting his position, making soft shushing sounds that seemed far too mature for someone her age. This child had been caring for her brother for a long time, probably since he was born. The social worker, a harried-looking woman in her 30s named Sandra Mills, arrived just after 10 o'clock. John knew Sandra from her nursing days. She was competent and caring, but overworked and dealing with impossible caseloads. "John, thank you for staying with them," Sandra said, sliding into the booth. She smiled at Lila. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Sandra. I'm here to help find you and Marcus a safe place to stay." Lila's grip on Marcus tightened. "We want to stay with Jean." Sandra glanced at Jean with raised eyebrows. Jean felt something shift in her chest, a stirring of purpose she hadn't felt since Harold died. "That's not how it works, honey," Sandra said gently. "We have special families who take care of children who need help, but John isn't certified as a foster family." "What would it take?" John asked, surprising herself with the question. Sandra blinked. "To become a foster family? Well, there's paperwork, background checks, home inspections, training classes. It usually takes 3 to 6 months to get approved. And, in the meantime, emergency placement with an approved family. We've got the Johnsons who might have room." "No." The word came out sharper than John intended. She looked at Lila's frightened face and Marcus's sleepy contentment in his sister's arms. These children had been abandoned once already. They didn't need to be shuffled from stranger to stranger like unwanted furniture. "I mean," Jean continued more calmly, "isn't there some kind of temporary arrangement? I was a registered nurse for 30 years. I raised 5 children. I've got the space and the time." Sandra considered this. "There is a kinship placement option, but that's usually for relatives, and emergency respite care, but that's only for 72 hours. Then let's start with 72 hours and see what we can work out from there." As Sandra filled out paperwork and made phone calls, Jean found herself studying Lila more carefully. The child was remarkably articulate for her age, with an almost adult-like awareness of her surroundings. She spoke softly but clearly, never used baby talk, and seemed to understand complex emotional dynamics. But it was more than maturity. There was something almost uncanny about the way Lila seemed to know things she shouldn't know. When Sandra mentioned the Johnson family, Lila immediately said, "They live in the blue house with the broken fence on Elm Street." When Murphy brought over fresh coffee, she thanked him by name, even though Jean was certain no one had introduced them. By noon, Jean was driving her Honda Civic carefully down the familiar roads toward her farmhouse, 2 car seats borrowed from the DSS office strapped into her back seat. Lila sat quietly, still holding Marcus, while Jean pointed out landmarks and tried to make conversation. "That's the elementary school where I used to take my kids for their programs," Jean said as they passed the brick building. "And that's the library where they have story time every Wednesday." "Mama used to read to me," Lila said quietly, "before she got sick." "What happened to your mama, sweetheart?" Lila was quiet for so long that Jean thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "She went to sleep and didn't wake up. That's when they took us to live with different people." Jean's throat tightened. She'd seen enough death in her nursing career to know that children often processed loss in simplified terms. "She went to sleep" could mean anything from an overdose to an accident to natural causes. But whatever had happened, these children had been living with strangers, being passed from home to home. Since their mother died, the farmhouse looked different with children in it. John had spent 2 years rattling around alone in rooms that seemed too big and too quiet. Now, suddenly, the space felt purposeful again. She showed Lila and Marcus to the guest bedroom, the same room where her own grandchildren had stayed during visits before they'd grown up and moved away. "This was my daughter Sarah's room when she was little," Jean said, pulling fresh sheets from the linen closet. "She painted those butterflies on the wall herself when she was about your age." Lila traced one of the painted butterflies with her finger. "It's beautiful. Sarah must have been very talented." The adult phrasing struck Jean again. Most 7-year-olds would have said pretty or nice. Lila spoke like someone much older, someone who'd learned to navigate adult conversations out of necessity. That evening, after Marcus was asleep in the portable crib Sandra had provided, Jean sat with Lila at the kitchen table, helping her with a coloring book. The girl worked methodically, staying carefully within the lines, choosing colors with deliberate precision. "Lila," Jean said gently, "can you tell me more about the stories your mama used to tell you? About the big white house?" Lila's crayon paused over the paper. "She said there was a man there who was my grandfather, but he couldn't tell anybody because his wife would be very angry." John's blood ran cold. "Your grandfather?" "Mama said he was very rich and had a big important job, but he loved my grandmother even though he wasn't supposed to. She said that's why we had to be secret, because some families don't want to share their love with people who look different." The pieces were starting to form a picture that made Jean's head spin. A rich, important man, a secret relationship, a child who couldn't be acknowledged. The Caldwell family had been Millbrook's royalty for decades, but Jean remembered whispers and rumors from years past. Thomas Caldwell had been known for his wandering eye, even after his marriage to Martha Patterson Caldwell. "Did your mama ever and tell you this grandfather's name?" Lila nodded solemnly. "Thomas. She said his name was Thomas, and someday he might want to meet me and Marcus. But she said we shouldn't count on it because rich people sometimes forget about the families they make by accident." Jean stared at this wise, wounded child who spoke of family secrets and abandonment with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd learned not to expect much from the adults in her life. If what Lila was saying was true, if she and Marcus were Thomas Caldwell's grandchildren, then these weren't just abandoned foster children. They were heirs to one of the largest fortunes in the county. And someone had been working very hard to make sure they disappeared. The next morning brought the kind of crisp October air that reminded Jean why she'd fallen in love with small-town life 50 years ago. She stood at her kitchen window, watching Lila in the backyard with Marcus, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold's death. A sense of being needed. Lila had woken before dawn and quietly changed Marcus's diaper without being asked. When Jean found them, the girl was sitting on the back porch steps, pointing out birds to her brother and naming their colors. The maternal responsibility this child carried was both heartbreaking and remarkable. "Good morning, early birds," Jean called from the doorway. "How does pancakes and bacon sound?" Lila's face lit up with the first genuine smile Jean had seen from her. "Marcus loves pancakes, don't you, baby?" She tickled the toddler's belly, earning delighted giggles that filled the quiet morning air. As they ate breakfast, Jean found herself studying Lila more carefully. Yesterday's revelations about Thomas Caldwell had kept her awake most of the night, turning over possibilities and implications. If this child was really Thomas's granddaughter, there were legal ramifications, inheritance, issues and family dynamics that could get very complicated very quickly. "Lila, would you like to draw some more pictures today?" Jean asked casually. "I have some nice paper and colored pencils." The girl nodded eagerly. After breakfast, Jean set her up at the kitchen table with art supplies, while Marcus played with wooden blocks on the floor nearby. Jean busied herself with dishes, but kept one eye on Lila's work. What emerged on the paper made Jean's hands still in the soapy water. Lila was drawing a house, not a child's simple box with a triangle roof, but a detailed architectural rendering that showed remarkable spatial awareness and memory. The house had tall white columns, a wraparound porch, dormers in the roof, and landscaping details that included specific types of trees and flowers. "That's a beautiful house, sweetheart," Jean said, drying her hands and moving closer. "Is this from one of your mama's stories?" Lila nodded, adding careful shading to the columns. She said there was a special room on the second floor with big windows that looked out over the garden. And behind the house, there was a place where someone planted roses that bloom all year because they're protected from the wind. Jean's breath caught. She knew this house intimately. She'd driven past it thousands of times, delivered medicine there during her nursing days, even attended a few charity functions when Harold was alive. The Caldwell Mansion on Magnolia Avenue. But Lila was drawing. Details that weren't visible from the street, details that suggested intimate knowledge of the property. "How does your mama know so much about this house?" "She used to work there when she was young," Lila said matter-of-factly, adding a garden gate to her drawing. "Before she met my daddy, she said the lady who lived there was very mean to her. But the man was kind. He gave her money when Marcus was born, but then he got sick and couldn't help us anymore." Jean sat down heavily at the table. Thomas Caldwell had suffered a stroke 3 years ago and had been in declining health ever since. If he'd been supporting Lila's mother financially, his illness would explain why the children ended up in the foster system. "Lila, do you remember your mama's full name?" "Sarah Elizabeth Johnson. She said Johnson was her daddy's name, but her mama had a different name before she got married." Johnson. Jean's mind raced through decades of memories, trying to place a young black woman named Sarah Johnson who might have worked for the Caldwells. Then it hit her. Sarah Johnson. Barely 18, who'd cleaned houses and worked catering jobs while trying to save money for college. Jean had treated her once in the emergency room after a car accident. Beautiful girl, smart as a whip, with dreams bigger than Millbrook could contain. That had been about 8 years ago. Jean remembered because Sarah had been visibly pregnant at the time, and there had been whispered speculation about who the father might be. A young black woman with no husband and no local family. The gossips had had a field day. "What happened to your daddy?" Jean asked gently. Lila, S. Crayon, paused. "Mama said he couldn't be my daddy in public because it would make too many people angry. She said some love has to be secret love, but that doesn't make it less real." The E innocence with which Lila spoke of such adult complexities made Jean's heart ache. This child had been raised on secrets and whispers, taught to understand that her very existence was somehow shameful to the people who should have loved her most. The phone rang, interrupting Jean's thoughts. Sandra's voice on the other end was strained with exhaustion. "Jean, I hate to bother you, but we've got a problem. The Johnsons had a family emergency and can't take the children. The only other option right now is the group home in Riverside, and that's really not appropriate. For a baby Marcus's age." "They're fine here, Sandra. The 72 hours isn't up yet." "I know, but my supervisor is asking questions. She wants to know why we're placing children with someone who isn't even in our system. And honestly, John, there's something else. I got a call this morning from someone claiming to be concerned about these children. Someone with influence who's asking a lot of questions about where they came from and where they're going." Jean's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of questions?" "About their parentage, about whether we'd done DNA testing, about their legal status and inheritance rights. Jean, someone with money and connections, is very interested in these children, and that makes me nervous." After hanging up, Jean found herself staring at Lila's drawing with new eyes. If the Caldwells knew about these children, if Martha Caldwell suspected her husband had fathered a child with the young woman who'd worked in their home, then Lila and Marcus weren't just abandoned foster kids. They were potential threats to a carefully maintained family image, and possibly significant financial holdings. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Jean was in the backyard, pushing Marcus on the old swing Harold had hung from the oak tree, when a black Cadillac pulled into her driveway. Through the back gate came Martha Caldwell herself, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and radiating the kind of controlled authority that came from decades of being Millbrook's unofficial queen. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martha said, her voice cool and polite. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced." Jean lifted Marcus from the swing, settling him on her hip. "Mrs. Caldwell, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Martha's eyes found Lila, who had frozen beside the flower beds where she'd been picking dandelions. The recognition in the older woman's face was unmistakable and filled with something that might have been fear. "I understand you're caring for some children who were recently found abandoned. As you know, my family has always been committed to child welfare in our community. I wanted to see if there was anything we could do to help." It was smoothly delivered, but Jean had been a nurse long enough to recognize when someone was fishing for information. "That's very kind of you," Jean replied carefully. "The children are doing well. They're in temporary care while social services works out permanent placement, of course, and their names are—" Jean hesitated. Something in Martha's manner, too controlled, too casual, set off every protective instinct she possessed. "I'm not sure that's appropriate information to share," Jean said finally. Martha. Quote S. Smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Naturally, it wouldn't want to overstep. It's just that there have been inquiries, people wondering about these children's background, their family connections. You understand how small towns can be." Lila stepped closer to Jean, instinctively seeking protection. Marcus, sensing the tension, began to fuss. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean," Jean said. "Don't you?" Martha's eyes fixed on Lila with an intensity that made the child shrink back. "Some children carry their parentage in their faces, Mrs. Whitmore. Family resemblances can be quite striking." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Martha Caldwell knew exactly who these children were, and she was here to assess the situation, to determine what kind of threat they posed to her family's reputation and wealth. "If you're concerned about the children's welfare, Mrs. Caldwell, I can assure you they're receiving excellent care. Now, if you'll excuse us, it's almost dinner time." Martha smiled again, but her eyes remained cold. "Of course. Please don't hesitate to call if you need anything. My family has significant resources, and we'd hate for these poor children to suffer from any lack of proper support." After the Cadillac disappeared down the lane, Jean stood in her yard, holding Marcus and watching Lila pick up the dandelions she'd dropped. The child's hands were shaking slightly. "Who was that lady?" Lila asked quietly. "Someone who thinks she's very important," Jean replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. That evening, after the children were asleep, Jean sat at her kitchen table with Harold's old address book and the cordless phone. She had calls to make and questions to ask. If Martha Caldwell thought she could intimidate an old woman into giving up two innocent children, she was about to learn that some people don't back down from a fight, especially when children's lives hang in the balance. The drawing Lila had made lay on the table between the salt and pepper shakers, its careful details seeming to whisper secrets that powerful people would kill to keep buried. Jean looked at her wedding ring, twisted it thoughtfully, and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Some battles choose you," Harold used to say. This one had just chosen her. Jean, S first call was to her old friend, Patricia Reeves, who'd worked in medical records at Millbrook General for 35 years before retiring. If anyone would remember the births and deaths that had shaped the town's quiet dramas, it would be Patricia. "Pat, it's Jean Whitmore. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Jean, never too late for you, honey. How are you holding up?" They exchanged pleasantries about health and weather, but Jean could hear the curiosity in Patricia's voice. Small towns didn't generate many late-evening phone calls unless something significant was happening. "Pat, I need to ask you about some old records. Do you remember a young woman named Sarah Johnson who might have given birth at the hospital about 7 or 8 years ago?" There was a pause. Patricia had always been discreet about confidential information, but she was also a mother and grandmother who understood when children's welfare was at stake. "Sarah Johnson, pretty girl, worked cleaning houses and catering events. Yes, I remember her. Had a little girl first, complicated delivery, but both mother and baby were healthy. Then came back about 18 months later with a baby boy. Different fathers, I think, though she never named either one on the birth certificates." Jean's heart sank a little. Different fathers. Well, that's what made it interesting. The boy looked nothing like his sister, different features, different coloring. But both children were beautiful. Sarah was devoted to them, brought them in for every checkup, made sure they had all their vaccinations. She was a good mother, Jean. Whatever trouble she got into later wasn't from lack of love for those babies. "What kind of trouble?" Patricia's voice dropped. "She died in a car accident about 3 years ago. Single-car crash on Highway 92 late at night. Lost control on that bad curve near Miller's Creek. Tragic thing, she was only 26. Jean closed her eyes, thinking of Lila's matter-of-fact explanation. Mama went to sleep and didn't wake up. Children often simplified death in ways that helped them cope, but Jean had seen enough accident victims to know that car crashes were rarely peaceful. "Pat, do you still have access to those birth records?" "Jean Whitmore, you know I can't. I'm not asking you to break any laws, but if someone needed to prove parentage for these children, hypothetically, what would that process look like?" Another pause. "Hypothetically, if there were questions about inheritance or custody, you'd need legal representation and a court order for DNA testing. But Jean, why are you asking about Sarah Johnson's children? They've been in the foster system since she died. Because they're sitting in my guest room right now, and I think someone very powerful wants them to disappear." The next morning brought grey skies and the promise of rain. Jean had slept poorly, her dreams filled with car crashes and crying children. She woke to find Lila already up, sitting by the bedroom window with Marcus in her lap, both of them watching. The clouds gather. "Good morning, early birds," Jean said, settling into the chair beside them. "Storm coming in." "I like storms," Lila said quietly. "Mama used to say thunder was just the sky having big feelings, and that was okay because everyone needs to cry sometimes." The simple wisdom of it made Jean's chest tighten. This child had learned to find comfort in chaos, probably because her short life had contained so much of it. Over breakfast, Jean found herself studying both children more carefully, looking for the family resemblances Martha Caldwell had mentioned. Lila had delicate features and intelligent dark eyes, but there was something about the set of her jaw and the way she held her head that seemed familiar. Marcus, as Patricia had noted, looked quite different. Lighter skin, softer features, but with the same alert intelligence in his eyes. "Lila, do you remember much about when Marcus was born?" The girl considered this while cutting her pancakes into precise squares. "I was little, maybe 5. Mama was sick for a long time before he came, and after he was born, she was sad for a while. She kept saying she was sorry, but I didn't know what she was sorry about. Postpartum depression, Jean thought. Common enough, but harder to treat when you're a single mother with no support system and no money for proper medical care. Did anyone help your mama with you and Marcus when you were babies?" "Sometimes a man would come visit. He was always very quiet, and he gave Mama money. She called him Mr. Tom, and she said he was Marcus's daddy, but he couldn't tell anyone because it would hurt his family." Jean's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. Thomas Caldwell. It had to be. What did Mr. Tom look like? Old, grey hair, nice hands. He always brought Marcus little toys and books. But after Mama got sick and went to the hospital that last time, he stopped coming. Thomas Caldwell's stroke had been 3 years ago, exactly when Sarah Johnson died. If Thomas had been supporting Sarah and the children, his sudden incapacity would have left them completely vulnerable. The phone rang, interrupting Jean's thoughts. Sandra's voice was more strained than the day before. "Jean, I've got bad news. My supervisor wants the children moved to the group home today. She says we can't justify keeping them in an unauthorized placement any longer." "Sandra, those children have been through enough trauma. Moving them again, I know, but there's pressure coming from above my supervisor, June. Someone with influence is making calls, asking questions, pushing for these kids to be placed in the state system where they can be more easily monitored. Or more easily lost," Jean thought grimly. "How much time do I have?" "A few hours, maybe. The transport van is scheduled for this afternoon." After hanging up, Jean stared out her kitchen window at the gathering storm. She could load the children in her car and drive away, but where? And what kind of life would that be for them? Always running, always hiding. Or she could fight. But fighting meant exposing the truth, and the truth might be more dangerous than anyone realized. She found Lila in the living room, quietly reading a picture book to Marcus. The domestic scene. The dark-haired child, patiently, teaching her baby brother, both of them safe and content in a warm, loving home, crystallized Jean's resolve. These children deserved more than just survival. They deserved family, stability, and the truth about their heritage. If Thomas Caldwell was Marcus's father, if the children had legal claims to the Caldwell estate, then someone needed to stand up for their rights. Jean went to Harold's old desk and pulled out the business card she'd saved for 2 years, the lawyer who'd helped them write their wills and handle the estate planning. David Chen had been young then, fresh out of law school, but he'd been thorough and honest. More importantly, he wasn't part of Millbrook's old boy network that had protected the Caldwells for generations. "Mr. Chen's office. This is Rebecca." "Rebecca, this is Jean Whitmore. I need to speak with David about a legal matter involving children's rights and inheritance law. He's in court this morning, Mrs. Whitmore, but I can have him call you back this afternoon. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him it involves 2 children who may be entitled to a significant inheritance, and someone is trying to make them disappear." There was a pause. "I'll get him the message immediately." Jean hung up and went to find the children. If they only had a few hours before the state tried to take them, she was going to make sure those hours counted. It was time for Lila and Marcus to see exactly what their birthright looked like, even if it meant driving past the Caldwell mansion and letting Martha Caldwell know that Jean Whitmore wasn't backing down from this fight. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep buried, especially when children's lives hung in the balance. The Caldwell mansion sat like a monument to old money and older secrets at the end of Magnolia Avenue, its white columns gleaming even under the overcast sky. Jean parked her Honda across the street, the engine ticking as it cooled, while Lila pressed her face to the window with an expression of wonder and recognition. "That's the house from my drawing," she whispered. "That's the house from Mama's stories." Even Marcus seemed captivated, his small hands pressed against the car window as he babbled softly at the imposing structure. The resemblance between Lila's detailed artwork and the actual mansion was uncanny. She had captured not just the basic architecture, but subtle details like the curved pathway to the front door and the specific arrangement of the azalea bushes. "How could you draw this so perfectly if you've never been here?" Jean asked gently. Lila's brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember Mama taking me here once, when I was really little. We didn't go inside, but she walked me around the yard and told me stories about each part. She said it was important that I remember, in case someday I needed to know." Jean felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Sarah Johnson had been preparing her daughter, giving her information that might be crucial later. But preparing her for what? What else? "Do you remember about that day? There was a lady working in the garden behind the house. She was very old, with white hair, and she was cutting roses. Mama said she was the grandmother I would never meet, but that I should know what she looked like anyway." Jean's blood ran cold. Martha Caldwell had been known for her prize-winning roses for decades. The garden behind the mansion was her private domain, carefully tended and fiercely protected. "Lila, did this grandmother see you that day?" The girl nodded solemnly. "She looked right at me. She dropped her flowers and stared, and then she said something mean to Mama. Mama picked me up and we left very fast." Jean could imagine the scene. Martha Caldwell confronted with the living proof of her husband's infidelity, seeing her own family's features reflected in a child who had no legal claim to the Caldwell name or fortune. They were interrupted by a tap on the passenger window. Jean's heart jumped until she recognized the gentle face of Pastor Robert Mills from Millbrook Community Church. She rolled down the window, grateful for a friendly face. "Jean, I thought that was your car. Everything all right?" Pastor Mills was one of the few people in Millbrook who'd known Jean and Harold as a couple, rather than just knowing her as the widowed nurse. He'd officiated their 50th wedding anniversary celebration and delivered Harold's eulogy with genuine warmth and understanding. "Hello, Robert. We're just doing a little sightseeing." His eyes took in the 2 children in the back seat, lingering on Lila's face with an expression of recognition that made Jean's pulse quicken. "Might I have a word with you privately?" Jean glanced at the children, then stepped out of the car. Pastor Mills led her a few steps away, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Jean, I heard you've been caring for some children who were found abandoned. Is that them?" "Yes. Sandra Mills from DSS asked me to provide temporary care. Sandra's my niece. You know, she mentioned the children's names." He paused, studying Lila through the car window. "That little girl looks remarkably like someone I used to know." "Oh?" "Sarah Johnson. Beautiful young woman who used to clean the church and help with our community dinners. She died in that terrible accident a few years back." His voice grew even quieter. John, there were rumors about Sarah and certain prominent families in this town. Ugly rumors that I never gave credence to. But seeing that child... What kind of rumors? Pastor Mills glanced around nervously. The kind that get people hurt if they're spoken aloud. But I will say this. I performed Sarah Johnson's funeral service, and there were people in attendance who surprised me. People who claim no connection to her, but who seemed deeply affected by her passing. Thomas Caldwell. The pastor's silence was answer enough. Robert, if these children are Thomas's grandchildren, they have rights. Legal rights, moral rights. They also have enemies, Jean. People who've spent decades protecting the Caldwell family reputation. People who see those children as threats rather than blessings. A black sedan was pulling up behind them, the same car Sandra had been driving the day before. Jean's heart sank as she recognized the official DSS plates. Mrs. Whitmore, Sandra called as she got out of the car. I've been looking for you. We need to transport the children now. Sandra, please, just give me until tomorrow. I can't. My supervisor is threatening my job if I don't follow protocol. And honestly, Jean, there have been complaints. Someone called this morning claiming you were exposing the children to inappropriate situations, taking them places they shouldn't be. Jean's eyes flicked to the Caldwell mansion, its windows reflecting the grey sky like watching eyes. Someone had been observing their every move. These children need stability, not another disruption. The children need to be in an authorized placement where they can receive proper care and evaluation. I'm sorry, Jean. I really am. As Sandra approached the car, Lila seemed to sense what was happening. The 7-year-old's face crumpled, and she clutched Marcus tighter. Please, she whispered as Sandra opened the car door. Please don't take us away from Jean. We'll be good, I promise. The heartbreak in the child's voice nearly broke Jean's resolve, but she forced herself to remain calm. These children had been traumatized enough by adult failures and broken promises. Lila, sweetheart, look at me. Jean knelt beside the car door, taking the girl's free hand. This isn't forever. I'm going to fight for you and Marcus, do you understand? I'm going to find a way to bring you home. You promise? John thought of Harold, of the promises they'd made to each other and kept for 50 years. She thought of her own children now, grown and scattered, and the fierce protective love that had driven every decision she'd made as a mother. I promise. As Sandra's sedan disappeared down Magnolia Avenue with the 2 most precious cargo it would ever carry, Jean stood alone on the sidewalk with Pastor Mills. The Caldwell mansion loomed behind them, its windows still reflecting the grey sky, but John thought she caught a glimpse of movement behind one of the upstairs curtains. What will you do now? Pastor Mills asked quietly. John looked at her wedding ring, twisted it thoughtfully, then met his eyes with a determination that surprised them both. I'm going to lawyer up, Robert, and then I'm going to war. Some battles chose you, Harold had always said. This one had chosen her, and she intended to win it, for Lila, for Marcus, and for the memory of a young mother who died trying to protect the children no one else wanted to claim. David Chen's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house on Main Street, squeezed between an insurance agency and a consignment shop that specialized in antique furniture. Jean climbed the narrow stairs with determination, clutching a manila folder containing everything she'd been able to gather about Lila and Marcus's parentage. The young lawyer looked older than Jean remembered, stress lines around his eyes and a weariness that came from fighting uphill battles in a legal system that favored money and connections over justice. But his handshake was firm and his attention focused as Jean laid out the situation. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, David said, leaning back in his chair. You believe these children are the biological grandchildren of Thomas Caldwell, that their mother was Sarah Johnson, and that someone with significant influence is trying to bury their legal claims to the Caldwell estate. That's exactly what I believe, and I think Martha Caldwell knows it too. David opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. I took the liberty of doing some preliminary research after your call. Thomas Caldwell's estate planning is a matter of public record, given his prominence in the community. His will, filed 3 years ago after his stroke, leaves everything to Martha and their legitimate children. But he paused, looking up at Jean. There's a provision for unknown heirs to make claims within 5 years of his death. Given his current health status, that window won't be open much longer. What would it take to establish the children's legitimacy? DNA evidence proving paternal relationship, birth certificates, and documentation of Thomas Caldwell's financial support of the children. The first 2 we can obtain through legal channels if we can file a proper claim. The third, I might be able to help with that. Jean opened her folder and pulled out a small notebook. This belonged to Sarah Johnson. It was in her personal effects when she died, and somehow made it into the children's belongings. I found it yesterday when I was going through their few possessions. David examined the notebook with interest. Sarah Johnson had kept meticulous records, dates, amounts, check numbers, monthly payments of $500, always from an account registered to TC Enterprises, one of Thomas Caldwell's business entities. The payments had continued right up until Sarah's death. This is substantial evidence of ongoing financial support, David said quietly. Combined with DNA evidence, it could establish both paternity and Thomas Caldwell's acknowledgement of responsibility for the child. Just one child? David looked up from the notebook. The payments began 7 years ago, which would coincide with the older child's birth. But they don't increase when the younger child is born. If Thomas Caldwell is only the father of one child... Marcus, June said, Lila told me that Mr. Tom was Marcus's daddy, but she never claimed him as her own father. That actually makes the case more complex. If only Marcus is Thomas Caldwell's biological son, then Lila has no legal claim to the estate. But as Marcus's sister and closest family member, she could potentially serve as his guardian and advocate until he reaches legal age. Jean thought of the fierce way Lila protected her baby brother, the maternal instincts that seemed far too developed for a 7-year-old. She'd been Marcus's guardian in every way that mattered since their mother died. David, these children have been through enough trauma. If we pursue this, what are we exposing them to? The lawyer was quiet for a long moment, staring out his window at the courthouse across the street. Custody battles can be brutal, John, especially when significant money is involved. The Caldwell family has resources, connections, and a reputation. To protect, they'll fight dirty if they have to. What's the alternative? Let these children disappear into the foster system. Let them grow up never knowing their heritage or their rights. There is one other consideration, David said carefully. If we're right about Martha Caldwell's involvement in keeping these children hidden, if she's been actively working to prevent their legal recognition, then we might be dealing with more than just family embarrassment. We could be looking at fraud, conspiracy to deprive minors of their inheritance rights, serious criminal charges. Jean felt a chill run down her spine. Martha Caldwell hadn't just been protecting her family's reputation. She'd been systematically working to steal these children's birthright. The phone on David's desk rang, and he answered with the wary tone of a man who'd learned to expect bad news. David Chen. Yes, she's here. He looked at Jean with concern. It's for you, your friend Sandra from Social Services. Jean took the phone with trembling hands. Sandra. June, thank God I found you. We have a problem, a big problem. Sandra's voice was strained with panic. Someone filed a complaint against you this morning, claiming you've been coaching the children to make false claims about their parentage. They're alleging that you're manipulating traumatized children for your own financial gain. That's ridiculous. I know it is, but it gets worse. Child Protective Services is opening an investigation. They want to interview you formally, and they're recommending that you have no further contact with the children until the investigation is complete. John sank into David's visitor chair, feeling the weight of 50 years of fighting bureaucracy and injustice settling on her shoulders. Who filed the complaint? I can't tell you that officially, but John, it came through channels that suggest someone with significant influence and legal representation. This isn't random. Someone is actively working to discredit you and eliminate your involvement with these children. After hanging up, Jean sat in silence while David reviewed the legal implications. The attack was sophisticated and well-timed, designed to isolate the children from the one person who'd been advocating for them while simultaneously undermining any future testimony Jean might provide about their family connections. "They're scared," David said finally. "This kind of preemptive strike means someone knows we're close to the truth, and they're willing to play hardball to stop us." "So, what do we do?" David pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "We accelerate everything. File for emergency. Custody based on the children's potential inheritance rights. Request immediate DNA testing, and we gather every piece of evidence we can find before someone decides to make it disappear." He looked up at Jean with the kind of determination she remembered from her own children when they decided to fight for something important. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand what you're getting into. The Caldwell family has been Millbrook, a royalty for 3 generations. They have money, political connections, and the kind of influence that can make life very difficult for people who oppose them. If we do this, we need to be prepared for a war." Jean thought of Lila's serious dark eyes and Marcus's delighted giggles. She thought of Sarah Johnson, dying alone in a car crash, with her children's future uncertain. She thought of Harold, who'd always taught her that some fights were worth having regardless of the personal cost. "Then we'd better make sure we win," she said. The Riverside County Group Home for Children sat like a concrete fortress on the outskirts of town, its institutional beige walls and barred windows designed more for containment than comfort. Jin parked across the street watching through the chain-link fence as children played in a bare courtyard under the supervision of overworked staff members. She, quote, been banned from official contact with Lila and Marcus, but David Chen had been clear. They needed to document the children's current conditions and well-being for their legal case. What Jean saw through that fence made her heart ache with fury. Lila sat alone on a bench, holding Marcus in her lap while he slept. Even from a distance, Jean could see the tension in the 7-year-old's shoulders, the way she constantly scanned the playground for potential threats. 2 older boys were throwing rocks near the fence, and every time a stone hit the ground, Lila flinched protectively around her brother. This wasn't care, it was warehousing. These children, who'd finally found safety and love in Jean's home, had been thrust back into an environment of chaos and uncertainty. Jean Quote's phone buzzed with a text from David. "Meeting with Pastor Mills in 1 hour. Says he has information we need to hear." The meeting took place in the church basement, away from the gossip network that operated through Millbrook's coffee shops and beauty salons. Pastor Mills looked older than Jean remembered, weighed down by the burden of secrets he'd carried for too many years. "I've been praying about this situation for days," he began, settling into a folding chair across from Jean and David. "I've always believed that some secrets are meant to protect people, but when children are suffering—" "What do you know, Robert?" Jean asked gently. "I know that Thomas Caldwell came to me for confession 7 years ago. He was struggling with guilt over an affair that had resulted in a pregnancy. He wanted God's forgiveness, but he also wanted advice about his responsibilities to the child." David leaned forward. "What did you tell him?" I told him that children don't choose their circumstances and that every child deserves support and love. I encouraged him to find a way to provide for the baby while protecting his family from scandal. The monthly payments to Sarah Johnson, Jean said. Pastor Mills nodded. Thomas took my advice seriously. He set up the financial support and asked me to serve as an intermediary, to check on Sarah and the children periodically, to make sure they had what they needed. So you knew about Lila and Marcus all along? I knew about Marcus. Thomas was very clear that he was the father of Sarah's second child, but Lila, the pastor paused, choosing his words carefully. Lila was different. Sarah had been very young when she became pregnant the first time, barely 18. She never spoke about Lila's father, never asked for support for her. It was as if that part of her past was too painful to discuss. David made notes on his legal pad. Did Thomas Caldwell acknowledge paternity of both children? Only Marcus, but Thomas grew very fond of Lila during his visits. He said she was remarkably intelligent, and he worried about her future. When Sarah died and the children entered foster care, Thomas wanted to help. But his stroke... What about Martha Caldwell? Jean interrupted. Did she know about Thomas's involvement with Sarah and the children? Pastor Mills's expression darkened. Martha has always been very protective of the family reputation. She discovered Thomas's financial support of Sarah about a year before his stroke. There was a terrible confrontation. I could hear them arguing from the church parking lot when they thought no one was around. What did she say? She demanded that Thomas end all contact with Sarah and the children. She said that illegitimate children were a threat to their legitimate heirs' inheritance, and that the family couldn't afford to acknowledge responsibility for every woman Thomas had dallied with over the years. Jean felt her temper flare. Every woman? There were others. Martha seemed to think so, though I have no direct knowledge of that. What I do know is that after that argument, Thomas became increasingly secretive about his support for Marcus. Instead of monthly checks, he began making cash payments through me. He was terrified that Martha would find out and cut off all support. David looked up from his notes. Pastor Mills, would you be willing to testify to these conversations under oath? The older man was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. If it means those children get the care and recognition they deserve, yes. But I need you to understand what we're up against. Martha Caldwell isn't just protecting money, she's protecting a carefully constructed image of respectability that her family has cultivated for generations. She views those children as existential threats. How serious? A threat? Pastor Mills met Jean's eyes with an expression that made her blood run cold. 3 years ago, I asked Martha directly what would happen to Sarah's children if something happened to Thomas's ability to support them. She said, and I quote, "Some problems solve themselves if you're patient enough." The implication hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah Johnson's car accident suddenly seemed less like tragic coincidence and more like convenient timing. "Robert," Jean said carefully, "do you think Sarah's death was truly an accident?" "I think Sarah was a young woman with 2 small children and no family support system who died in a single-car crash on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. I think the timing of her death, just weeks after Thomas's stroke eliminated his ability to provide financial support, was remarkably convenient for people who wanted her and her children to disappear." David's pen had stopped moving. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything that could get me sued for slander," Pastor Mills said firmly. "I'm simply sharing my observations about timing, convenience, and the kinds of problems that powerful people sometimes find creative solutions for." They sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the implications. If Martha Caldwell had been involved in Sarah Johnson's death, then Lila and Marcus weren't just facing a custody battle, they were in genuine physical danger. "And there's something else," Pastor Mills said quietly. "Yesterday I received a visit from someone representing the Caldwell family. They wanted to know what I might testify to if asked about Thomas's relationship with Sarah Johnson." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that my conversations with parishioners are confidential, but that I'm also obligated to protect children from harm." He looked directly at Jean. "They offered the church a very generous donation in exchange for my discretion. When I declined, they suggested that my memory of events might be unreliable given my age and recent health problems." Jean's hands clenched into fists. "They threatened you. They made their position clear. They also made it clear that people who oppose the Caldwell family often find life in Millbrook becomes very difficult. Business licenses get revoked, bank loans get called in, social circles close ranks." David gathered his notes and stood up. "Pastor Mills, thank you for your courage in sharing this information. We'll need a formal statement, but I understand the risks you're taking." As they prepared to leave, Pastor Mills caught Jean's arm. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've watched you fight for what's right for 30 years. But this time, you're not just fighting bureaucracy or ignorance. You're fighting people who have a lot to lose and the resources to eliminate threats. Please be careful." That evening, Jean sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the empty chairs where Lila and Marcus had eaten breakfast just days before. The house felt hollow without their presence, but her resolve had never been stronger. She picked up the phone and dialed David Chen's number. "David, it's Jean. I want you to file those emergency custody papers first thing tomorrow morning. And I want you to request a formal investigation into Sarah Johnson's death. Jean, are you sure? Once we take that step, there's no going back." Jean looked at her wedding ring, thinking of Harold and the promises they'd made to protect the vulnerable and fight for justice. "Some fights choose you," she said quietly. "This one chose me, and I intend to win it." Dr. Patricia Reeves had been the county medical examiner for 15 years before retiring, and she'd kept meticulous records of every case that had crossed her desk. When Jean called and asked about Sarah Johnson's autopsy report, Patricia's voice carried the weight of professional concern mixed with personal friendship. "John, you know I can't discuss specific cases over the phone." "Patricia, I'm not asking you to violate any confidentialities. But if there were irregularities in that case, if there were questions that weren't properly investigated, meet me at Murphy's Diner in an hour. And Jean, bring that lawyer of yours." David Chen was already waiting in a corner booth when Jean arrived, his face grim with the expression of someone who'd spent the morning discovering unpleasant truths. Patricia slid in across from them, a manila envelope clutched in her weathered hands. "Before I show you this," Patricia said quietly, "I need to know why you're asking. What's your interest in Sarah Johnson's death?" Jean explained about Lila and Marcus, about the potential inheritance claim, and about the growing evidence that Martha Caldwell had been working to eliminate any trace of Thomas's illegitimate son. Patricia listened without interruption, her face growing increasingly troubled. "I was afraid of something like this," she said finally. "Sarah Johnson's case bothered me from the beginning, but I was overruled by people above my pay grade." She opened the envelope and pulled out a thick file folder. "This is a copy of everything: the official autopsy report, my preliminary findings, the toxicology results, and the notes I kept about pressure from outside sources to expedite the case closure." David opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. Jean watched his face, trying to read the legal implications in his furrowed brow and tightened jaw. Dr. Reeves, David said finally, according to your preliminary findings, Sarah Johnson had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, but the official cause of death is listed as accident due to loss of vehicle control. That's correct. I found evidence that Sarah had struggled with someone shortly before her death, bruising consistent with being grabbed forcefully, scratches that suggested she'd tried to fight off an attacker. But when I tried to investigate further, I was told to focus on the vehicle accident and close the case quickly. Jean's blood ran cold. Someone killed her. Someone killed her, Patricia confirmed. The car accident was staged to cover up the murder. Sarah died from blunt force trauma to the head that occurred before the vehicle crash. The positioning of her body, the lack of expected injuries from the actual collision, everything pointed to homicide. Why didn't you fight the ruling? Patricia's expression hardened. I tried. I requested additional investigation time, suggested we bring in state experts, recommended treating it as a suspicious death. But I was told that prominent community members had raised concerns about the impact of a prolonged investigation on Sarah's children and that the kindest thing would be to let them have closure. Prominent community members, David repeated. I was never told specifically who was applying pressure, but the message was clear. Close the case as an accident or face professional consequences. I'd been medical examiner for 15 years with a spotless record, but suddenly my competence was being questioned, my methods criticized. Jean felt anger burning in her chest like acid. So you let them cover up a murder? I documented everything, Patricia said firmly. Every piece of evidence, every suspicious finding, every instance of outside pressure. I knew that someday someone would ask the right questions. David was making rapid notes. Dr. Reeves, would you be willing to testify that Sarah Johnson was murdered and that the investigation was deliberately suppressed? If it means justice for that young woman and protection for her children, absolutely. Patricia pulled out another set of documents. There's more. I did some investigating on my own after the case was closed. Sarah had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before her death. Her neighbor mentioned it to me at the funeral. Said Sarah had seemed frightened, had started locking her doors and checking on her children multiple times during the night. Did the neighbor report this to the police? She tried, but the investigating officer told her it wasn't relevant to a traffic accident case. Jean's mind was racing, connecting pieces that painted an increasingly horrifying picture. Who was the investigating officer? Patricia consulted her notes. Detective Robert Caldwell. The name hit Jean like a physical blow. Caldwell. Martha Caldwell's nephew. He's been with the sheriff's department for 12 years. Currently serves as lead detective on major cases. Patricia's voice was bitter with disgust. Quite a coincidence that he was assigned to investigate the death of his aunt's problem. David set down his pen and stared across the table at them. We're not just dealing with inheritance fraud. We're dealing with murder, conspiracy, and official corruption. This case involves law enforcement, the medical examiner's office, and one of the most powerful families in the county, which explains why they've been so aggressive about isolating those children, Jean said. If Lila or Marcus ever remember anything about their mother's death, if they overheard threatening phone calls or saw suspicious visitors, they're witnesses, David finished, and potential victims. Patricia leaned forward, her voice urgent. There's something else you need to know. Sarah Johnson had been asking questions before she died. She'd contacted a lawyer in the state capital about paternity testing for Marcus, about establishing formal child support, about Marcus's inheritance rights. She was going to expose Thomas Caldwell as Marcus's father. More than that, she'd discovered that Thomas had other illegitimate children, at least 2 other women he'd had affairs with over the years. She was considering organizing them to make collective inheritance claims. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Martha Caldwell hadn't just been protecting her family from one embarrassing affair, she'd been protecting them from multiple inheritance claims that could have devastated the Caldwell fortune. "How many children are we talking about?" David asked. "I don't know exactly, but Sarah had been in contact with at least 2 other women. If they'd all filed paternity suits simultaneously, if they'd demanded DNA testing and formal recognition, it would have destroyed the Caldwell family financially and socially," Jean said. Martha had motive to eliminate Sarah and anyone else who might expose the truth. David was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the State Attorney General's office. This is beyond local jurisdiction. We need federal investigators who can't be influenced by the Caldwell family's connections." As David stepped outside to make his calls, Patricia caught Jean's arm. "Mrs. Whitmore, you need to understand what you're up against. If Martha Caldwell was willing to murder Sarah Johnson to protect her family's interests, those children are in mortal danger, and so are you. What choice do I have? Let them disappear into the system, pretend I never learned the truth. You could take them and run, leave Millbrook, start over somewhere else where the Caldwell name doesn't carry weight." Jean thought of Lila's serious dark eyes and Marcus's trusting smile. She thought of Sarah Johnson, probably killed for trying to secure her children's future. She thought of Harold, who'd always taught her that running from injustice only made it stronger. "No," she said firmly, "those children deserve their birthright, and Sarah Johnson deserves justice. If Martha Caldwell thinks she can murder her way out of responsibility, she's about to learn that some people don't back down from a fight." David returned with news that made them all sit up straighter. "The State Attorney General is opening a formal investigation into Sarah Johnson's death. They're sending investigators tomorrow to review all evidence and interview witnesses. And they're issuing an emergency protective order for Lila and Marcus. Those children are going into state protective custody until this is resolved." "Away from the Caldwell family's influence?" Jean asked. "Away from everyone's influence, including ours." "But Jean," David's expression was grave, "if we're right about Martha Caldwell's involvement in Sarah's murder, if she killed once to protect her family's secrets, she might be willing to kill again." Jean looked at her wedding ring, twisted it thoughtfully, and made a decision that would change everything. "Then we'd better move fast," she said, "because those children have been victims long enough. It's time they had someone fighting for them who isn't afraid of Martha Caldwell or her family's dirty money." The war was no longer just about inheritance rights or custody battles. It was about justice, truth, and making sure that a murdered mother's children survived long enough to claim what was rightfully theirs. The state investigators arrived in Millbrook like a quiet storm. Unmarked sedans parked outside the courthouse, and serious-faced agents conducting interviews in rooms usually reserved for traffic violations and property disputes. Jean had given her statement to Agent Sarah Martinez, a soft-spoken woman with steel in her eyes, who specialized in cases involving crimes against children. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Martinez had said after reviewing Jean's evidence, "I want you to understand that you've potentially uncovered one of the most extensive conspiracy cases we've seen in rural crime. If your allegations are correct, we're looking at murder, conspiracy, official corruption, and systematic deprivation of minors' rights." Now Jean sat in David Chen's office, watching through the window as Martha Caldwell's black Cadillac pulled up outside the courthouse across the street. The older woman emerged with 2 men in expensive suits, lawyers from the state capitol, Jean assumed, brought in to handle a crisis that local attorneys couldn't manage. "She knows," David said, following Jean's gaze. "The state investigation has her scared." "Good," Jean replied with a satisfaction that surprised her. "She should be scared." David's phone rang, and he answered with the cautious tone he'd developed over the past few days. After a brief conversation, he hung up with an expression that mixed relief and concern. That was Agent Martinez. They've located Lila and Marcus and moved them to a secure facility in the state capital. The children are safe, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lila has been asking for you constantly. She's apparently not eating well and has been having nightmares. The child. Psychologist says she's showing signs of severe separation anxiety." Jean's heart clenched. "Can I see them?" "Not yet. But Agent Martinez wants to interview you again tomorrow. She says Lila has been sharing information about her mother's death that corroborates your theories." "What kind of information?" "Apparently, Lila remembers more about the night her mother died than anyone realized. The child has been carrying trauma that she didn't know how to process." Jean thought of the serious 7-year-old who'd carried the weight of protecting her baby brother, who'd spoken with wisdom beyond her years about love and secrets and families who don't want to share. Of course, Lila remembered. Children often saw and heard things that adults assumed they'd forgotten. That evening, Jean sat in Harold's favorite armchair, surrounded by the documents and photographs that had become her war room. Sarah Johnson's notebook lay open beside Patricia Reeves' medical files, while David's legal briefs covered the coffee table like battle plans. She was so absorbed in reviewing testimony transcripts that she almost missed the sound of gravel crunching in her driveway. When she looked up, her blood ran cold. Martha Caldwell stood on her front porch, illuminated by the security light Harold had installed years ago. Jean considered not answering, but Martha had already seen her through the window. "There was something to be said for facing your enemy on your own territory." "Mrs. Caldwell," Jean said, opening the door but not inviting her in. "This is unexpected." "Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced. I thought it was time we had a frank conversation about our mutual interests." Martha's voice was perfectly modulated, the tone of someone accustomed to getting her way through careful application of authority and barely veiled threats. "I wasn't aware we had mutual interests." "Oh, but we do. We both want what's best for those poor children. They've been through so much trauma, so much uncertainty. What they need now is stability, not more disruption." Jean stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. She wouldn't allow Martha Caldwell's poison into the home where she'd found peace with Harold, where she'd briefly given Lila and Marcus the love they deserved. What they need is justice and the truth about their mother's death. Martha's perfectly composed mask slipped slightly. Sarah Johnson's death was a tragedy, a young woman with poor judgment who made bad choices and paid the ultimate price. But dragging her children through prolonged investigations and legal battles won't bring her back. No, but it might prevent you from getting away with murder. The words hung in the October air like frost, visible and sharp. Martha's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Jean saw something genuinely frightening. Not just anger or frustration, but the cold calculation of someone who'd already killed once and was considering whether she needed to kill again. "That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Whitmore. The kind of accusation that could get someone into significant legal trouble if they can't prove it." "I don't need to prove it. The state investigators will do that." Martha smiled then, and it was worse than her anger. "Will they? Investigations are complex things, Mrs. Whitmore. Evidence gets misplaced. Witnesses recant their testimony. Memories prove unreliable. And sometimes well-meaning people realize they've misinterpreted situations and withdraw their complaints." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering you an opportunity to reconsider your position. My family has significant resources, and we're prepared to be generous to people who understand the value of discretion." Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a check, already filled out and signed. The amount made Jean's stomach lurch. More money than she'd see in 5 years of her nursing pension. "This is just a token of our appreciation for your temporary care of those children." If you were to realize that you'd misunderstood certain situations, if you were to withdraw your cooperation with this investigation, we'd be prepared to show our gratitude in even more substantial ways. Jean looked at the check, at the carefully formed numbers that represented more financial security than she'd ever known. She thought of her aging house that needed repairs, of the medical bills that would inevitably come as she got older, of the peace and comfort that money could buy. Then she thought of Lila's nightmares, of Marcus's trusting smile, of Sarah Johnson, dying alone on a dark road because she'd tried to secure her children's future. "Mrs. Caldwell," Jean said quietly, "you can take your money and go straight to hell." Martha's composure cracked completely. "You foolish old woman. Do you have any idea what you're dealing with? Do you think your little investigation threatens me? I've been protecting my family's interests for 40 years. I've handled problems far more complex than one meddling widow and 2 unwanted children. Problems like Sarah Johnson?" "Sarah Johnson was a greedy little whore who thought she could blackmail my family. She thought having Thomas's bastard gave her some kind of leverage." Martha's voice was venomous now, all pretense of civility abandoned. She learned differently. The confession hung between them, clear and damning. Jean felt her phone in her pocket, wished she'd thought to activate its recording function before opening the door. "You killed her. I solved a problem that threatened my family's future, just like I've solved other problems over the years." Martha stepped closer, and Jean caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with something that might have been fear. Sarah wasn't the first woman to try to use pregnancy as a weapon against the Caldwells, and she won't be the last. But she was the most persistent, and persistence can be dangerous. "And now you're threatening to solve the problem of her children the same way." Martha's smile was cold as January ice. "Those children are better off disappearing into the foster system where they belong. Children of whores rarely amount to anything, anyway. But if you continue to interfere, if you keep pushing this investigation, you might find that accidents can happen to anyone, even interfering old women who don't know when to mind their own business." Jean felt Harold's presence so strongly in that moment that she could almost see him standing beside her, solid and protective and completely unafraid. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said with a calmness that surprised them both, "my husband used to say that some people mistake kindness for weakness. You've made that mistake with me." She pulled out her phone, and Martha's eyes widened as she realized their entire conversation had been recorded. "You see, I've been a nurse for 30 years. I've learned to be prepared for emergencies. I activated my phone's recording function the moment I saw your car in my driveway." Martha lunged for the phone, but Jean stepped back quickly, her thumb already hitting the send button. "That recording is now uploaded to a secure server and copied to Agent Martinez's email. Even if something unfortunate happens to me tonight, the evidence will survive." Martha Caldwell stared at her with the expression of someone who'd just watched their carefully constructed world crumble around them. For the first time in 40 years, she'd encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with money, influence, or violence. "This isn't over," Martha said finally, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "No," Jean agreed, watching the black Cadillac disappear into the darkness. "It's not. But it will be soon." She stood on her porch long after the taillights had vanished, thinking about justice and courage and the weight of promises made to children who'd already lost too much. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when truth would face down power and see which one proved stronger. Jean twisted her wedding ring and smiled for the first time in days. Harold would have been proud. The Millbrook courthouse had never seen anything like the media circus that descended on the small town when news of Martha Caldwell's arrest broke. Reporters from 3 states crowded the sidewalks, their cameras focused on the building where 3 generations of Caldwell influence was finally being called to account. Jean sat in the witness waiting room, her hands folded calmly in her lap while chaos swirled around her. Agent Martinez had warned her that Martha's defense team would try to paint her as a delusional old woman seeking attention, that they'd attack her credibility and motives with everything they had. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Martinez said, settling into the chair beside her, "the recording you made is damning evidence, but we need your testimony to establish the full scope of the conspiracy. Are you ready for this?" John thought of Lila and Marcus, still in protective custody 3 hours away, waiting to learn whether the adults in their lives would finally keep them safe. She thought of Sarah Johnson, who died trying to secure her children's future. She thought of Harold, who'd always believed that doing the right thing was worth any personal cost. "I'm ready." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow. Seating arranged in the hallway for observers who couldn't find places inside. John recognized faces from 30 years of living in Millbrook. Shopkeepers and teachers, farmers and bank clerks, all of them struggling to reconcile the Martha Caldwell they thought they knew with the woman accused of murder and conspiracy. Martha sat at the defendant's table flanked by her expensive lawyers, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression coldly defiant. When John entered the courtroom, Martha's eyes followed her with undisguised hatred. The prosecution calls Jean Whitmore to the stand. John had testified in medical malpractice cases during her nursing career, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of this moment. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on her as she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. "Mrs. Whitmore," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court how you first encountered the children known as Lila and Marcus." Jean's voice was steady as she recounted finding the children behind Murphy's diner, taking them into her home, and gradually discovering their connection to the Caldwell family. She spoke of Lila's uncanny knowledge of the Caldwell mansion, of Sarah Johnson's notebook documenting financial support from Thomas Caldwell, of the growing evidence that someone had been working to erase these children from existence. "And what happened when you tried to advocate for these children's rights?" "I was accused of manipulating traumatized children for financial gain. The children were removed from my care and placed in the state system. Someone with significant influence was working to discredit me and silence anyone who might support the children's legal claims." The prosecutor played the audio recording Jean had made of Martha's confession, her voice filling the courtroom with chilling clarity. "Sarah Johnson was a greedy little whore who thought she could blackmail my family. She learned differently." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Several jurors looked physically ill. Martha's lawyers objected frantically, but the damage was done. Martha Caldwell had confessed to murder in her own words. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you fear for your safety after recording this conversation?" "Yes. Martha Caldwell had just confessed to murdering Sarah Johnson, and she'd made it clear that anyone who threatened her family's interests might suffer the same fate." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, as Agent Martinez had warned. He painted Jean as a lonely widow seeking attention, suggested she'd coached the children to make false claims, insinuated that her age made her an unreliable witness. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it true that you saw an opportunity to exploit these children's situation for your own emotional and financial benefit?" Jean looked directly at the lawyer, then at Martha Caldwell, then at the packed gallery of her neighbors and friends. "Sir, I'm 73 years old. My husband is dead, my children are grown and gone, and I have no need for money or attention. What I have is a lifetime of experience caring for children and protecting the vulnerable. When I found Lila and Marcus abandoned behind a diner, cold and hungry and frightened, I did what any decent person would do. I helped them." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I didn't ask to uncover a murder conspiracy. I didn't seek out to fight with one of the most powerful families in this county. But when I learned that two innocent children were being denied their rightful heritage, when I discovered that their mother had been killed for trying to secure their future, I chose to stand up for them, because that's what adults are supposed to do for children: protect them, fight for them, and make sure they're safe and loved. But you have no proof that my client was involved in Sarah Johnson's death. I have her confession, recorded in her own words. I have evidence of a systematic cover-up involving law enforcement and the medical examiner's office. I have 3 years of these children being shuffled through the foster system while someone worked to erase any trace of their connection to the Caldwell family. Jean looked directly at the jury. I have the truth, and sometimes that's all you need. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces carried the weight of justice finally served. The foreman stood, his voice clear and strong in the hushed courtroom. On the charge of murder in the 1st degree, we find the defendant, Martha Patricia Caldwell, guilty. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Martha Caldwell's face went ashen, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking as the reality of her situation settled over her. Her lawyers immediately began making motions for appeal, but their voices were lost in the emotional tumult that filled the room. On the charge of conspiracy to deprive minors of inheritance rights, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. Judge Harrison called for order, but Jean could feel the collective exhale of a community that had lived under the Caldwell family's shadow for generations. For the first time in living memory, money and influence hadn't been enough to escape. The consequences of criminal behavior. As the bailiff led Martha away in handcuffs, she turned to look directly at Jean. The hatred in her eyes was replaced by something that might have been respect, the grudging acknowledgement of one fighter recognizing another. Mrs. Whitmore, Agent Martinez said, appearing at Jean's side as the courtroom slowly emptied. There are 2 young people who've been waiting very patiently to see you. Jean's heart leaped. Lila and Marcus. They're in a conference room upstairs with their victim's advocate. The state has granted you temporary custody pending the resolution of their inheritance claims. It seems you've proven yourself quite capable of protecting their interests. The walk up the courthouse stairs felt like the longest of Jean's life. She'd fought so hard for this moment, sacrificed her quiet widowhood and peaceful retirement, to wage war against people who thought children were disposable. Now finally, she was about to be reunited with the 2 small souls who'd changed everything. Lila saw her first through the conference room window. The 7-year-old was holding Marcus in her lap, both of them looking smaller and more fragile than Jean remembered. But when Lila spotted her, her face transformed with pure joy. "Jean!" she cried, launching herself across the room and into Jean's waiting arms. "I knew you'd come back for us. I told Marcus you promised, and you always keep your promises." Jean knelt to wrap both children in her embrace, feeling the pieces of her heart that had been scattered over the past weeks, finally settling back into place. Marcus babbled happily, his small hands patting her face with the uncomplicated affection of a toddler who'd found his safe person again. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this," John whispered into Lila's hair. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from it." "It's okay," Lila said, with the wisdom that continued to astound Jean. "Mama used to say that sometimes the people who love you have to go away to fight dragons, but they always come back when the dragons are gone." David Chen appeared in the doorway with a smile wider than Jean had ever seen him wear. "The state has also reached a settlement regarding the children's inheritance claims. It seems that facing multiple felony convictions motivated the remaining Caldwell heirs to be more cooperative than they might otherwise have been." "What does that mean?" It means Marcus is entitled to his full share of Thomas Caldwell's estate, approximately $3.7 million, held in trust until his 18th birthday. And Lila, while not Thomas's biological daughter, has been granted a substantial settlement as Marcus's sister and primary caregiver. John felt dizzy with the enormity of it. These children, who'd been abandoned behind a diner with nothing but a threadbare blanket, were now among the wealthiest young people in the county. What happens now? Now you go home, Agent Martinez said from the doorway. All three of you. The state has approved your emergency custody petition, and given your performance as these children's advocate, I suspect the permanent adoption paperwork will be a formality. As they walked down the courthouse steps into the late afternoon sunlight, Jean felt Harold's presence so strongly she almost turned to look for him. He'd always said that the best battles were the ones fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Lila slipped her small hand into Jean's weathered one, while Marcus dozed contentedly in Jean's other arm. They were no longer a lonely widow and two abandoned children. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by love, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that every child deserves protection and justice. The dragons were finally gone, and they were going home. 6 months later, Jean stood in her kitchen on a bright April morning, watching Lila help Marcus practice walking in the backyard. The toddler had grown sturdy and confident, his laughter echoing across the garden that Jean had finally replanted. Harold's vegetable patch was thriving again, tended now by 4 hands instead of 2, Jean's weathered ones guiding Lila's small, eager fingers as they learned together about seeds and soil and the patience required to nurture growing things.